Thank you, Mr. Chair. Congratulations to the witnesses. 3 topics I want to raise. First, to follow up on Senator Booker on the Gaza humanitarian situation, Mr. Plitt. The need for Israel to defend itself against an organization pledged to its destruction is clear. But what we're watching here is the effort in Gaza a defense against Hamas, or is it a war against Gazans or Palestinians? And we're looking at the evidence, and we look at rhetoric, and we look at civilian casualties, and we look at humanitarian aid, and we look at discussions about the future of Palestinian self-autonomy. And the evidence is troubling in terms of answering the question. It troubles a lot of us. To me, the clearest bit of evidence where positive changes could make the biggest difference is in the humanitarian space. Civilian casualties, because of the way Hamas embeds with civilians, very, very challenging. But the effort to get aid to 2.2 million people who've suffered under Hamas, that would be the quickest way that Israel could demonstrate this is about defeating Hamas. It's not about hurting Gazans or Palestinians. And my colleagues and I have been extremely disappointed about the pace, about the quantity of aid. And when we talk to our own, U.S. officials in the region, you mentioned Ambassador Satterfield, they're not happy about it either. Things that shouldn't be hard to get agreement on, open the Kerem Shalom border crossing, are incredibly difficult. They take way too long, and then that leads to really difficult challenges for 2.2 million people, again, who've largely suffered under Hamas. And so I just want to underline an exclamation point, this notion that humanitarian aid and hostage release, I think, are the 2 kind of highest priorities in this, and they're connected. Hostage release in the past came with a cessation of hostilities, and that led more humanitarian aid to be able to easily be distributed. So I think the effort on this committee is going to be very focused on this humanitarian aid question, and obviously your role with USAID will put you right in the middle of that. Ms. O'Donnell, I just want to say a word about UNESCO. Senator Ricketts asked you the questions about how hard UNESCO's history has been, the double standard applied to Israel. We would want our UN bodies to call out bad behavior if they see it, but the double standard applied to Israel compared to other nations has been so obvious. And yet, when the U.S. is absent from the institutions like the UN Human Rights Council or UNESCO, it gets worse. When we absented ourselves from these institutions, I had a meeting once with Michelle Bachelet when she was the Human Rights Commissioner, and she said, look, is there a double standard? There's a double standard. It's outrageous. But when the U.S. is absent, it gets worse and worse and worse. And when the U.S. comes and is back at the table, it may still not be to our liking, it gets better. UNESCO hosted a conference on anti-Semitism in October, just a few months ago. They wouldn't have done that in the past. They're doing that now. Europe was wanting them to do it as well as the United States. But as frustrating as these institutions are, and do stand strong for our principles and stand strong for support for democratic allies, stand strong for human rights, stand strong with Israel against the double standard, it's probably not going to be to your liking, but your standing strong will move the center of the dialogue in a better place. So I would encourage you. And then finally, Madam Ambassador, I'm intrigued / worried about the upcoming elections in Indonesia, just from what I'm reading. So Indonesia has a president who can't run for another term because of term limits. The president's son is running for vice president. The Indonesian constitution says presidents and vice presidents have to be 40 years old, but the president's son is 36 years old, and the Constitutional Court, I gather, has rendered a ruling that he is qualified to run for vice president. We have a similar provision in the U.S. Constitution. There's parts of the Constitution, like what is due process, that are vague. What is cruel and unusual punishment? That's vague. But you got to be 35 years old is about the clearest thing in the Constitution. So how am I to understand a constitutional ruling in a nation that has a 40-year-old age limit for VP saying that a 36-year-old meets the qualification?
So you spoke correctly. The Constitutional Court made a decision. I am not an expert in Indonesian constitutional law, but there was a decision that allowed the current president's oldest son to run as vice president with the current defense minister. And there has been follow-up. There is another process where that is investigated, and there was a decision related to that, but that there was also a decision that since this had already happened, that this would continue on. So he is running as vice president.
Well, it's obviously troubling. I mean, I credit everything you said about the importance of the relationship and even about improvements in the relationship, which I think are notable, and that should be celebrated. But a nation that would casually cast aside a clear constitutional command about who can run and who can't run, that should at least be a red flag for us. And in terms of your priorities, should you be confirmed, promoting rule of law and democracy, I think should climb the ladder. Thank you.
I agree, Senator.
Mm-hmm.